I read you Mark's first part of the account of the resurrection at the beginning of the service. Now, let me read you the rest of the story. Mark 16, verses 7 and 8. But go, tell his disciples and Peter, he is going ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him just as he told you. Trembling and bewildered, the women went out and fled from the tomb. They said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. That's how the Gospel of Mark ends, at least in some of the oldest and best manuscripts that we have. Doesn't that seem like a strange way to end the book? Mark, the earliest gospel written, doesn't end with great courage. He doesn't end with great hope, but with trembling, bewildered women fleeing in silence. But as you're going to see, the way that this story ends is one of the reasons we can believe the whole story of the resurrection is in fact true. If somebody made up this story, they wouldn't have ended it this way. In fact, people have tried since ancient times to write alternative endings to the book of Mark. You'll see it in some of your English translations, but most mark these editions with a footnote that says some of the oldest and best manuscripts we have of the Gospel of Mark end at verse 8, just the way I read it to you this morning. And that's important, as you'll see. One of the unique aspects of Christianity when compared to any other faith, any other religious tradition, is that it traces its origin to one particular event on one particular day in history. That's not true of Buddhism, it's not true of Judaism, it's not true of Islam or atheism or any of the other great world religions. One day, there was no such thing as a Christian church. And then suddenly, overnight, there was. There was suddenly a group of people who believed in the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the grave. And they were even willing to suffer the most terrible kinds of persecution and even death for his sake. That's a historical fact. There are 4 biographies of Jesus in the New Testament, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. In all 4 of them, the last week in Jesus' life is given the most attention. That's unprecedented in any biography. Why did they spend so much of their Gospels focusing on the last week in Jesus' life? It's because these earlier followers of Jesus insisted with remarkable unity that one event created the movement that we call today Christianity. It was the belief that Jesus was resurrected from the dead. Now, in our day, many people think the resurrection, if it was true, would be good news. I mean, isn't it good news that there's a God who would forgive us, a God who promises he'll walk with us and care for us as the good shepherd of the 23rd Psalm? Isn't it good news that we get to go to heaven someday, not ultimately because of who we are and what we've done, but because of who he was and what he did for us on the cross? That's good news. It's great news. A lot of people believe it would be good news of great joy, just as the angel said at Jesus' birth, but if they're honest, they're not sure if it's true news. The thinking goes like this. In ancient days, people didn't have science the way they had today, so they were a little bit gullible. They were willing to believe anything. So when Jesus died, some people felt a vague sense of his presence with them, still inspiring them. And over time, this vague sense of Jesus' presence morphed into stories that he'd been risen from the dead. But that theory is only plausible if you ignore the historical record that even people who weren't Christians in the first century wrote in their histories and in their letters. That from the very first days of the early church, Jesus' followers proclaimed that he had risen from the dead. But that's not all that you have to ignore if you're going to believe that the resurrection of Jesus was just made up by Christians many, many years after the death of Jesus. You also have to ignore how the Jewish people in the first century thought about resurrection in their historical and their cultural context. When the resurrection took place, the women who first came to the tomb knew it was true news, but it took a while for them to understand whether or not it was good news. That's why at first, immediately after they left the tomb, they didn't tell anybody. They had to process all of this because it presented to them some huge problems with what they'd been taught since they were children by the Jewish rabbis, something very different about death, what comes after death, and what resurrection was, and what the Messiah would be. The human race has always been troubled by what happens to you when you die. In the ancient world, some people believe that when you die, you just go out like a candle. There was an ancient tombstone epitaph that was so popular over several centuries that it appears both in Latin and Greek. It says, It says, I was not, I was, I am not, I don't care. Now that's a cheery thing to put on your tombstone, isn't it? But that was the way of thinking for many people at that time, and there are many people today who still think that. When you die, that's just it. There's nothing more. There were many, many more people, both in ancient times and today, who believe that there's something more after you die. That's why there's so many religions. In the ancient world, this was usually a shadowy underworld where departed souls went upon death. Some called it Hades. The Jews called it Sheol. In this underworld, spirits had a shadowy existence, and while many religions had the most virtuous people eventually moving on from that dark place to someone better, they didn't agree where that was, only that it was definitely not back in this world. Of course, there were others, especially in the Far Eastern religions and New Age religions, that believed in an endless cycle of reincarnations, but the Jews didn't believe that. The Jews had a unique take on what eventually happened to those who were obedient to God and died. While they believed everyone initially went to Sheol after they died, they believed the godly would someday be resurrected. This was a belief that was well established in Judaism long before Jesus' lifetime. You see, the Jews had long believed that the problem isn't just that we die, but that this world is a mess filled with pain and suffering. The crux of this problem is humans can't fix the mess. The Jews believed that there was a great and powerful God who created all things, and one day he'll bring the righteous back to life and heal all of creation. They believed that the resurrection wasn't just about the afterlife, but about a God-perfected, God-redeemed, God-set right life. They believed that God would step in, forgive the sins of his people, establish justice, and suffering would come to an end, and he would heal all creation, and then he would resurrect his people to enjoy the new creation. They believed that when that happened, it would be dramatic, it would be obvious, and it would be undeniable, because all of God's righteous ones would experience resurrection together at the same time at the end of the history. They believed we were living in this age, but when the resurrection occurs, we'll all be ushered into the age to come. Now, while just about everybody else in the ancient world believed that history was either a dead end or an endless cycle of reincarnations, Israel introduced something new to the human race. The idea that history was headed somewhere, as Tennyson wrote, one far-off divine event toward which all creation moves. Now, what does that have to do with resurrection, Jesus' resurrection? Well, nobody in Israel would have ever thought to claim that one individual had been resurrected in the middle of history. If somebody were to claim that, the response would have been, has disease been eradicated? Has justice broken out? Has suffering ended? Stop talking nonsense. Saying one individual had been resurrected by themselves in the middle of history instead of at the end of history would, to a Jew, would be like someone saying to us, well, Jalen Hurt, the quarterback of the Philadelphia Eagles and 2025 Super Bowl's most valuable player, he won the Super Bowl, but the rest of the Philadelphia Eagles team will have to wait for another year to be Super Bowl champs. You'd say, what? Talk about a word salad that doesn't make any sense. Everybody knows that football is a team sport, and not just the quarterback or even the game's most valuable player. They don't win alone. When the Philadelphia Eagles won the Super Bowl, the whole team won. To suggest anything else is just nonsense. Well, just like the Super Bowls, the Jews believed resurrection was a team deal. Jesus brought Lazarus back from the grave, but Lazarus lived a few more years and then he died again. Resurrection is permanent. It's rising from the dead, never to die again. And the Jews believe it only happens at the end of time, and all the righteous are raised together. That's what threw the women off when they came to the tomb. The angels said that Jesus was risen from the dead. But they must have thought, how can this be? What exactly does this mean in relationship to everything we've been taught all of our lives about life after death and resurrection and about the Messiah? Now, Jesus did fulfill a lot of the Jewish expectations regarding their long, prophetically predicted and awaited Messiah. He was a descendant of King David, and he did do a lot of miracles. And he did ride into Jerusalem on Palm Sunday, coming from the Mount of Olives, riding on a donkey's colt, all just as the prophets had predicted hundreds of years before. But on Palm Sunday, when Jesus didn't ride into Jerusalem and drive the Romans out of the city, but instead drove the money changers out of the temple, well, that's when things began to happen that confused his followers. Things weren't happening from that point on the way the Jews had been taught by their rabbis that they were supposed to happen. And to top all the confusion off, on Friday when Jesus was crucified, it seemed like he couldn't possibly be the Messiah because didn't the Bible say, "Cursed is anyone who dies on a tree"? Indeed, Jesus did take the curse of our sins upon himself on the cross, but Jesus' followers didn't understand that until after the resurrection, when the Bible tells us Jesus opened the entire Old Testament scriptures for them and showed them how he had in fact perfectly lived out all the prophets had predicted and what the scriptures taught. But Jesus' followers were initially confused when Jesus went to the cross and died, because the Jews had completely missed what is today the 53rd chapter of one of their greatest prophets, Isaiah. There he predicted a suffering servant Messiah who would take our sins upon himself, who would be bruised for our iniquities, who would be put to death but then brought back to life. No Jewish teacher had ever taught that. And no Jewish preacher had ever taught that a single individual would be resurrected before the end of time. No Jew had been taught there had to be a cross before there was a crown. No wonder the women at the tomb were bewildered. No wonder they were confused at first and didn't say anything to anyone. What does this all mean? You see, when Jesus died, even though he'd predicted several times to his disciples that he was going up to Jerusalem to suffer and die, they didn't want to hear it. They even rebuked Jesus for suggesting such a thing. So when Jesus was crucified, none of his followers said, "Well, this is great. Everything's going according to plan." None of his followers thought Jesus' death was a good thing. The picture we get in all four Gospels is Jesus' followers were completely disheartened. They were dismayed. They were disappointed. They were disillusioned. They were dispirited. And they were all terrified that they might be hunted down and killed next. But then suddenly they weren't afraid anymore. Suddenly, as a matter of historical record, this same group of people became convinced that Jesus Christ had been resurrected, and they were motivated to spread this news at enormous cost to themselves. Why? Well, because they saw, they talked with, they even ate fish with, put their fingers into the wounds, Thomas did, of the risen Christ. So how can we know the resurrection really happened, as Jesus' followers proclaimed, starting just 3 days after his death? Some people think in ancient times people were gullible, ready to believe anything. C.S. Lewis calls this chronological snobbery. The belief that ancient people were stupid. They weren't. They understood that dead people normally stayed dead. I love a story that Ken Davis tells of a woman who looked out her window one morning and she saw her family's German shepherd coming home with the neighbor's rabbit in its mouth. They didn't get along particularly well with these neighbors, so she knew this is going to be bad. This is a disaster. So she grabbed the broom, ran out into the yard. She pummels her dog until it drops the dead rabbit from its mouth. Seeing the dead rabbit, she panics. She grabs the rabbit. She took it inside. She shampooed it. She blow-dried it back to its original fluffiness. She combed it until the rabbit looked like a rabbit again. Then she snuck into her neighbor's backyard and propped it back up in its pen. An hour later, she heard screams coming from next door. She ran next door and asked her neighbor what was going on. Our rabbit, her neighbor cried. He died 2 weeks ago. We buried him in the backyard, and now he's back." Now, people in ancient times knew dead rabbits stayed dead, just as people do today, and so did dead people. New Testament scholar N.T. Wright notes there were many messianic movements in the first century. In every case, the would-be Messiah got crucified by the Romans just as Jesus did. In not one single case do we hear the slightest mention of the disappointed followers claiming their hero had been raised from the dead. They knew better. And why did they know better? Because, as we've already seen, for the Jews, resurrection wasn't supposed to be a private event. It was a team sport. If you were following a particular would-be Messiah and he was crucified by Rome, you had two choices. You could disband the movement or you look for another would-be Messiah. As we would expect, Jesus' followers believed they were finished in the wake of Jesus' execution. But then two things happened. First, witnesses saw the tomb was empty. And second, Jesus began appearing to his followers. If the Romans could have produced the body, they would have. The graves of martyred heroes, especially crucified messiahs, were commonly venerated as shrines by their followers. And that would have caused problems both for the Romans and for the Jewish religious leaders. The two problems they had in ending the Jesus movement were, first, the tomb was empty, and no one could produce the body. And second, the idea the tomb was empty because Jesus had been resurrected by God is simply not a story that someone would have made up, not if they wanted to attract new Jewish followers to their movement, because it violated the entire Jewish understanding of what was going to happen when Messiah came and history ended. But new followers did come, starting with 5,000 men plus women and children the first time the gospel was ever preached at Pentecost, only 50 days after the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And what was preached on that Pentecost? Peter preached that the crucified Christ had been raised from the dead. Why did people believe it? Because the eyewitness accounts were credible. There were miraculous signs. They heard the message in their own native languages. And also there were many people who had seen the unusual supernatural events of Jesus' life that led up to his crucifixion. There's another reason we know the resurrection really happened. Mark says that the empty tomb was first discovered by Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome. Now notice what all three of these people have in common. They're all women. Today, we might not think that would affect anyone's opinion of whether or not the resurrection really happened, but in ancient Israel, women were so low in status, they weren't regarded as credible witnesses. They weren't even allowed to give testimony in Jewish or Roman courts. If you did a terrible crime and only women witnessed it, there's a good chance that you would be let off because there were no witnesses in the eyes of the court. How extraordinary, then, that Mark points out that the first eyewitnesses to the empty tomb were women. In fact, all four Gospels point out that women were the first witnesses. If you're going to make up a story of Jesus' resurrection that runs counter to everything the Jews believe, there's no advantage to having women serve as your eyewitnesses. It would have seriously undermined the credibility of your claim. The only plausible explanation for why all four Gospels say that the first witnesses of the empty tomb were women is because it was women who found the empty tomb, and the tomb was in fact empty. And then when Jesus began to appear first to one and then to another, first to Mary Magdalene at the tomb, and then on the road to Emmaus to two men, and then to a whole room full of his disciples, and then to Thomas, and then to more than 500 at one time, no one could any longer deny that Jesus was alive. But it wasn't until Jesus began to teach his disciples in the 40 days of resurrection appearances after the resurrection that they began to understand what the death, burial, and resurrection meant for their own lives and what it means for each one of our lives. And that's where this all gets very personal. Jesus taught that every single person has to decide if they're going to accept or reject the resurrected Christ. A pastor I know had a woman come into his office one day to share how she'd come to realize that she needed something more in her life. She'd spent most of her life living far away from God. She wasn't at peace. She wasn't happy with her life. She told him one day by chance she heard her first Christian radio program on radio station in the car while she was driving, just by chance. She liked the upbeat music that they told, that the songs and the people talking on the radio assured her that there was a God who was for her, who would forgive her, who would help her if she just turned to him. But for months and months, she didn't make any kind of commitment. It was while listening, though, to Christian radio around Easter that she realized that if Jesus really was raised from the dead, well, that changed everything. She told the pastor she studied and finally came to the conclusion that Jesus really was raised from the dead. So she went home one afternoon and she stood in her kitchen on the threshold between her kitchen and the living room. Then she said aloud, God, when I step across that line and walk across that threshold into the living room, I want you to know that I'm leaving my old life behind. I want to be forgiven. I want to be your child. I want Jesus to be my forgiver and my friend and my leader. And then she walked across the line and she told the pastor, that's the biggest step I've ever taken in my life, because once I entered into a relationship with God, I wasn't afraid anymore. I wasn't afraid of what might happen in life because I knew the good shepherd of the 23rd Psalm was taking care of me. And I wasn't afraid to die anymore because finally I knew I was going to heaven when I died. Acts 22:21, she says, the first verse that I ever memorized, whosoever calls on the name of the Lord shall be saved. And now whenever I have problems or questions or doubts, I remember that verse. And I remember the day I stepped across the line in my house. The question for all of us on this Easter Sunday morning is, have you ever taken that step in your own life? If you haven't, today's a great day to do it. The story of the resurrection is not just good news, it's true news. When Jesus says, whoever lives and believes in me will never die, he meant it. That's not a metaphor. It's not some vague hope. It means that death has no power to take you from the arms of your loving Heavenly Father. Jesus said, because I live, ye shall live also. Guilt can't separate you from God. Whatever bad news that you face, if you've crossed that line, if you've trusted Jesus Christ, you have a resurrection coming. Whoever you are, if you've taken the all-important step of faith, you're living in a new reality. The Father's arms are strong enough to carry you through whatever you're facing in life. The Bible tells us the same power that raised Christ from the dead is available to help you face all the circumstances of life. And ultimately, you too have a resurrection coming. Would you join me as we stand together and sing hymn number 119, The First Lord's Day?